Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our first Research Spotlight webinar of 2025. Happy New Year to all of you, and I hope you all had safe and healthy holidays. We are kicking things off this year by discussing research breakthroughs that we've had over the past year. And I am excited to dive into some of this really exciting science that we've had in HD over the past year and share why I think that is launching hope from the lab to the clinic. I'm Dr. Sarah Hernandez, the Director of Research Programs at the Hereditary Disease Foundation. At the Foundation, I oversee our scientific research portfolio, and I manage the grants programs and coordinate scientific programming. I'm also a co-editor-in-chief at HDBuzz, where scientists write in plain language about research and clinical trial news for the global HD community. It's a really great resource for understanding HD science, so if you don't know about it, I highly recommend that you check it out. All right, I'm going to share my screen, but before we start, I want to remind you that you can ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the talk. So make sure you're using the Q&A box, not the chat box. I will certainly do my best to answer as many of those as we can. We should have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, so send your questions in as you think of them, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. All right, let's get started because there's a lot of very exciting research to cover. When I was thinking about how to put this talk together, I was trying to think of ways to convey how much work goes into a scientific project to get it from the lab to the point where it's even considered a breakthrough, because there's a ton of work that happens before it becomes a news headline, before it's tested in clinical trials, and honestly, really before anyone even hears about it. And so I was thinking, this is kind of like when you see rock stars on stage, naturally. When you see these really big bands that have been super successful in music, sometimes it seems like they just popped up on the scene overnight and they just became an overnight success. But when you listen to the interviews from those people, they will tell you that they were actually practicing in their garage for 10 years before they even had a song on the radio. And honestly, this is a lot like science. You know, we've all seen these really big headlines for advancements that are being made in the lab to find treatments for various diseases that are considered these huge breakthroughs that are really the reason that we're launching hope from the lab to the clinic. But before that, those big breakthroughs, there were clinical trials. And before the clinical trials, there were experiments that were being done in the lab. And so to tell you about all of the stellar breakthroughs that we've had in HD research in 2024, that I feel like is really launching hope from the lab to the clinic, I will tell you a three-part story. And that involves these really big headlines, which is the final stage, is when we see these breakthroughs in the news and everyone hears about them. And this is like when we see the rock stars on stage, right? I will tell you the story of the hope, which are all the really exciting updates that we've had from the clinic this year, which is like hearing your song on the radio for the first time. And then, of course, all of the hard work that goes into this. And these are all of the experiments that are being done to feed this clinical trial pipeline, which is like the years of practice that these bands are putting in before anyone even hears about them. All right, so we're going to start by talking about all of the hard work. So these are some of the really cool experiments that are being done in the lab right now. To study Huntington's, scientists need tools, right? Like they need very small tools, molecular tools, in fact, so that they can see what's going on inside a cell. But currently, a lot of these tools, they can't really show us a clear picture. And frequently, scientists use a tool called antibodies to study what's going on inside the cell. And antibodies are a specialized protein that's produced by your immune system that you can make against pretty much any protein within the cell. And these can be generated for genes or something else. But any science value, antibodies have a lot of limitations. And for Huntington's, one of those limitations is that they aren't actually specific for the copy of the molecule that's causing the disease. And so they can help us get an idea of what's going on inside the cell, but it's kind of like looking at the world without your glasses on. You have an idea of what you're looking at and you kind of know what's going on, but it's not a super clear picture. And people are working to develop better tools. So in 2024, the Hereditary Disease Foundation funded a grant to Dr. Rachel Harding, who is working on improving our ability to see what Huntington is doing inside of cells. So Rachel is a structural biologist who's developing chemical structures that are very specific, not only to different forms of Huntington, but also Huntington in complex with other proteins inside the cell. The specificity of these tools that Rachel's developing will really clarify our understanding of HD, which is like putting your glasses on for the first time. People are also working to improve delivery strategies of drugs. In 2023, the Hereditary Disease Foundation awarded one of our inaugural Transformative Research Awards to a team led by Dr. Bev Davidson. And she and Doctors Leslie Thompson and Jung Ho Cha are working to improve viral gene therapy delivery. And they're working to advance a drug for HD with this improved delivery system. So currently, for diseases like HD, these approaches, viral delivery approaches, require brain surgery, where a drug is delivered using several injections. And currently, it's 6 injections per hemisphere that deliver a relatively substantial volume of liquid. But Bev and her team are working to reduce that. They want to go from those several injections that deliver a relatively large volume of liquid down to a single injection that would deliver a single drop. So this would drastically reduce the amount of drug that's needed. It would reduce the cost, and it would also shorten the surgery length and the amount of material that's delivered to the brain. So moving in this type of direction for HD could be a really big step forward in improving delivery strategies for gene therapies. Another improved drug delivery strategy that people are working on is something called focused ultrasound to open the blood-brain barrier. You can think of the blood-brain barrier like a brick wall. It protects our brain from harmful things that may be in our blood. So things like viruses and medications. And so the blood-brain barrier is really the first challenge in drug delivery for Huntington's because we want to get things inside the brain. But the blood-brain barrier is keeping them out. And so this is why current approaches for HD either require spinal injections or brain surgery. But one way around this is to temporarily open the blood-brain barrier, let the drugs in, and then close it. This is an approach that's currently being tested in clinical trials for cancer, and researchers are also working on it for HD. In 2021, the Hereditary Disease Foundation awarded a grant to Dr. Nick Todd for his work with focused ultrasound to deliver drugs for HD. And since then, Nick has received a larger government grant, and he is continuing to advance his work in this space. It's really these types of studies, right? Like those that are currently being done in cells and animal models in the lab that help feed the clinical trial pipeline that we have in HD. Because it's the basic research, like those 3 studies that I've highlighted here, that later translates into these clinical trials. Because once an experimental idea gets to the clinic, that's when it really provides the hope that that idea will lead to a treatment for HD. But before I share the hope that's going on in the HD space with the clinical trials, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to have a brief biology lesson. I'm going to take you back to your high school Bio 101 class. So hopefully it wasn't traumatic for you, but I promise it will be brief. And we are going to go over the central dogma of molecular biology. And so the central dogma states that we have genes that are transcribed into message or something called messenger RNA or mRNA, and that is made into protein. And so your protein is the functional unit of your cell. This is what gets stuff done. And so an approach that a lot of companies are taking in the clinic is something called Huntington lowering. So they're degrading the message, and without the message, there is no protein. So the genetic makeup of that individual is not changed. The gene remains the same. It's just that they're degrading the message, and without the message, there's no protein. So any function that that protein has cannot be carried out. And this approach follows a very reasonable hypothesis in HD biology, and that is that the expanded copy of the gene creates an abnormal protein, and that abnormal protein is a nefarious player inside the cell. Okay, so hopefully we're all on the same page with Huntington lowering. And now we're going to cover current strategies for HD therapies. And really these fall into 2 categories: those that are aimed at treating the symptoms and those that are aimed at modifying the disease. And for disease-modifying treatments, the approach that's currently furthest in the clinic is Huntington lowering. And this also has the most variety in the ways that people are approaching it. So I'm going to go through these names pretty quickly right now, and then I'll fill in the details later. So if it sounds like alphabet soup a bit right now, hopefully it's more clear by the time we get done with this section. And I will come back to this slide at the end and fill in those details. So for Huntington lowering, people are taking approaches like ASOs or antisense oligonucleotides. They're using splice modulators. They're using gene therapy, something called RNA interference or RNAi, and then also protein degraders. And so don't worry if you didn't catch every detail here. What I hope you did catch, though, is that there's a lot of different approaches that people are taking just with Huntington lowering. This is just one avenue that people are taking for disease modification. So there's a lot going on in this space right now. And for gene therapy, there are two different flavors, AAVs, or adeno-associated viruses, also known as viral delivery, and then something called LNPs, or lipid nanoparticles. And then there's also other potential disease-modifying treatments that are being explored. And those are related to somatic expansion, which is really taking the flavor of splice modulators right now. There's cell replacement, and then there's other things that people are doing that really don't fit into one of these categories right now. So for the rest of this section, I'm really going to focus on the Huntington lowering approaches that I have highlighted here. And I'll fill in the details with these approaches and different companies that are working in this space. And then I promise I'll come back to this slide at the end and overlay that information. So the first Huntington lowering strategy that was out of the gate was something called antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs. And so ASOs are short synthetic pieces of genetic material. And biologically, the way that they work is that they're complementary to the Huntington message, which causes double-stranded message, and the cell doesn't like that, so it degrades it. And without the message, there is no protein. All right, so that's how it works biologically. But in reality, what most people need to know about the way that it works is that we introduce a set of instructions into a cell that tell the cell to stop production. So this is like if a government agency walked into a factory and said, shut it down, we don't want Huntington protein, and someone pushed a big red button, no more Huntington protein. So the first company to test this was really Roche and Genentech. They were testing their Huntington lowering ASO called tominersen in trials, and they are currently testing tominersen in a phase 2 trial called Generation HD2 that we learned just in December has completed enrollment. Wave Life Sciences was almost immediately behind Roche, testing their ASO that is actually specific to the expanded version of Huntington that causes HD. They're currently on their third iteration of their ASO called Wave 003. It's in a phase 1/2 trial right now, and I will talk a little bit more about Wave in the next section, which covers some of the big headlines that we've had this year. And there's also Vico Therapeutics. They're testing their ASO that's specific to the version of Huntington that causes HD as well. Their approach is unique because they're going after the CAG repeat. So that means if it's successful, it might not just work for HD, it could work for other diseases that are caused by CAGs, because Huntington is not alone. And so all of these different trials, these ASOs are delivered via lumbar puncture, so a spinal injection, which some people see as a downside. But a major advantage to this approach is that these drugs are tailored to be specific for the gene of interest. Injection intervals are currently being tested in some of these trials, but it's likely with this approach, it would require a lumbar puncture every few months. Another approach is very similar, so I didn't even change my picture here, but I did change the wording up here. So another approach that's similar is called RNA interference, or RNAi. And so this also uses a synthetic piece of genetic material. The difference between RNAi and ASOs is that RNAi takes advantage of the cell's own molecular machinery to produce the genetic material. So this is a detail that matters for researchers and drug developers, but for the general public, these nuances to these approaches really don't matter. They're both very similar with a very similar outcome, which is to lower Huntington. This approach is being taken by several companies. Atalanta Therapeutics is still testing their drug in animal models, and Alnylam Pharmaceuticals recently announced their phase 1 trial, and they announced in December that they just gave the first dose of their drug to someone. And at least for Alnylam, this drug will be delivered via spinal injection. Also in this space is a company called XORNA. And so XORNA is currently running a phase 1 trial. And what's unique about their drug, excuse me, is that it's being delivered intravenously, so through IV. And this is actually the very first Huntington lowering drug that's delivered this way. So something very interesting to keep an eye on. Other approaches that people are using to lower Huntington is gene therapy. And so right now this is being explored through 2 ways. Number 1, using an adeno-associated virus, or AAV. This is a harmless virus, essentially where you scoop out the middle part and you stuff it with instructions that tell the cell to lower Huntington. A second flavor of gene therapy is something called a lipid nanoparticle, or LNP, which is essentially a fat bubble where you do the same thing. You just stuff it with instructions to lower Huntington. Unicure is currently the furthest with this approach. They're testing their drug AMT-130. This is the one that's given via brain surgery with 6 different injections. And I will talk more about Unicure in the next section. Lattice Bio is also working in this area. And I mentioned Lattice in the last section because they were part of that transformative research award being led by Bev Davidson to improve viral delivery. So they're the ones that are working on viral-based deliveries for HD that are hoping to get these strategies down to a lower volume with just one injection. And then also testing viral gene therapy are companies Spark Therapeutics and LifeEdit. They're advancing viral-based gene therapy. So that's these 4 companies. And then LifeEdit, along with Incisive Genetics, are also doing LNPs. So these little micro fat bubbles. And so the major difference between these gene therapies, whether people are moving forward with either these viral delivery or the LNPs, is the way that they're delivered. And so currently, these viral delivery strategies would require brain surgery, which is an obvious drawback of this approach. But a major advantage of LNPs, so those micro fat bubbles, is that they're really diverse. Currently for HD, they would require brain surgery, but in theory, these LNPs, they can be delivered in almost any way. So if you think about COVID vaccines, some of those were LNP-based that delivered mRNA against SARS-CoV-2. And so compared to AAVs, LNPs, they're easier to produce, they're cheaper to produce in large quantities, and there are several advantages there. And while right now, both of these strategies, either viral or LNP, would require brain surgery, which is a drawback, the advantage is that these are one and done approaches. So in theory, you would just need one surgery and Huntington should be lower for the rest of your life. Another strategy that people are taking to lower Huntington is through splice modulators. So these are drugs that are taken as a pill. I mean, super cool. So they're taken as a pill to lower Huntington, and they essentially work by splicing the message, which means they rearrange the Huntington message. They put a stop sign right in the middle where it doesn't make any sense, much like this stop sign in the middle of a field. The cell sees that it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't bother producing the protein. So PTC Therapeutics are using this approach with their drug called Votoplam. And that is currently being tested in a phase 2 trial. And Skyhawk Therapeutics is testing a very similar molecule called Sky0515 in a phase 1. And I will share a more in-depth update about both of those companies in the next section. So these small molecule splice modulators are exciting because they're taken as a pill, which is obviously a huge advantage. But a disadvantage is that they are not designed to be specific to Huntington. So there's a lot of effort that's being put into understanding what off-target effects these drugs might have, like what unintended consequences could there be. But if we can get the dose right so that Huntington is lowered to a right amount, taking a Huntington lowering drug as a pill could be a real game changer. So this is a really exciting area. Okay, so we've definitely covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And as promised, I've come back to this slide and I've overlaid it with some of these companies. And so all of the companies that you're seeing right now either have a regulatory approved drug, which right now just includes the ones in the symptomatic area, or they have ongoing clinical trials. And so you'll probably notice that most of them fall here in the, sorry, my mouse is lagging, but most of them fall here in the Huntington lowering area where I focused my talk. And that's because Huntington lowering was really the first strategy out of the gate. And that's why I focused here today. But there are companies that are working to advance each of these other strategies. And so now the slide includes not just companies with approved drugs that treat symptoms and companies that have ongoing clinical trials, but also companies that are actively sharing their data at conferences related to their work on HD, and they're headed toward the clinic. And the involvement of pharmaceutical companies in the HD space does not even stop there. There are even more people that are working in the HD space. So right now you're seeing names of companies populate on this slide that have either made a public commitment to working on HD, they have an ongoing HD clinical trial, or they've had a public presence at an HD conference. And so this has become my absolute favorite slide to show in every single talk. It was originally created by Dr. Leora Fox of Fox Scientific Consulting. And what I hope you're realizing is that there's a whole lot of people working on HD. We are truly living in the age of clinical trials, and there are companies that are committed to exploring different strategies that will get us to a treatment for HD. Because it's really once the work gets to this point where the companies are making headway in clinical trials that we start to see the headlines. And 2024 has been a really big year for HD headlines. We have had an absolute windfall of great news in HD trials, particularly for Huntington lowering trials. And I'm excited to share that with you. So in June of this year, we had a clinical trial update from Wave about their Select HD trial for Wave 003. So this is the drug that's given via a spinal injection aimed to lower Huntington. And what's unique about their approach is that they're specifically targeting the expanded copy of Huntington, leaving the unexpanded copy alone. So this is a phase 1/2 trial, and it's aimed at testing the safety. And in this recent data release, we learned that overall, the drug does appear to be safe and well tolerated, and it is indeed targeting the expanded copy and lowering Huntington. And so that's really important, actually. This is the first time that any drug has been able to show that there's an impact on only the expanded copy of Huntington. And this is a big milestone for the HD community, because if we find out in the future that we need to specifically target the expanded copy, we now know from this trial that we have that capability. And while this trial is primarily designed to test safety, they also looked at clinical measurements along the way to try and get hints about if their drug is working. And when they looked at this, the data seemed to suggest that there's a slight decrease in symptoms for people taking this drug. So again, this is a small trial. It's primarily designed to test safety, not the ability of this drug to modify HD. And while these results are preliminary, they're very encouraging. Also this summer, we had a really positive clinical trial update from Unicure. So they're testing their drug AMT-130 in a phase 1/2 trial in both the US and Europe. And so AMT-130 is a gene therapy. It's the one that's delivered via brain surgery to lower Huntington. So brain surgery, it's clearly high risk, but it's also high reward. In theory, this is a one and done approach. Once this drug is given, Huntington should be lowered for life. But because it's a one and done approach, any effects of this drug, whether they're good or bad, they cannot be undone. So understandably, this trial has been rolled out very slowly and it has a long-term follow-up. But so far, what we learned over the summer was from the data from people who were given AMT-130 2 years ago. So this was a 2-year follow-up data. And the key was that overall it appears to be safe and well tolerated. But they also looked at different clinical measurements along the way to get hints about what this drug is doing. And really, at the end of the day, it's these clinical measurements that are the most important readout. Having a drug that is effective at slowing or stopping progression of the clinical signs of HD, that's what we all want. That is what everyone is after. And so, similar to the results from Wave, their data seem to suggest there may be an improvement in clinical outcomes. That's excellent news. And then also exciting news, I do feel like an infomercial, but wait, there's more. So also good news that we heard from them in December is that Unicure sat down with the FDA to agree on what metrics they would need to meet to get accelerated approval of this drug. And so for the very first time, we know what regulatory agencies will accept to give a green light for a drug for HD. Like, this is huge. I feel like I cannot overstate this. This is not only really great news for Unicure, but this is great news for everyone who is testing an HD drug in trials, right? Like, the bar has been set. Like, we know exactly what needs to be done to get accelerated approval of a drug. Not full approval, accelerated approval. And if anyone's interested in the nuances of that, happy to discuss more in the Q&A, but super good news. Also this summer, in June, we received a clinical trial update from PTC Therapeutics about their drug Votoplam. It was formerly called PTC 518. And so this is that oral splice modulator, stop sign in the middle of the field, it doesn't make the protein. And so they were testing their drug in a trial called Pivot HD. Again, this is a trial primarily designed to test safety, but they too are looking at different clinical measurements along the way. And the biggest takeaways from the June data release from PTC were that, number one, levels of the biomarker NFL remain stable. And so NFL, neurofilament light, is a protein that's released from dying brain cells. And we know that levels of NFL go up as HD progresses. And so a lot of researchers think that if we can hold NFL levels steady, that means we're preserving brain cell health and we could be slowing signs and symptoms of HD. So the fact that people who were on Votoplam, and this was 12-month data, so these people have been taking Votoplam for 12 months, the fact that they seem to have steady NFL levels, that is a really good sign. And the second biggest takeaway from the data release was related to clinical measurements. PTC showed data that seems to suggest that Votoplam is slowing progression of clinical signs and symptoms. So this is all very exciting news. And during their last data release in June, PTC shared that they were gearing up for a phase 3, but that was before the conversation that uniQure had with the FDA. And so it's not clear if their plan has changed based on that recent announcement. It's not clear if they're going to move forward with a phase 3 while they seek accelerated approval, or if they're just going to go for the phase 3. That's not clear, but we will certainly know more this summer when PTC is expected to give another update. But what we do know is that PTC recently entered into a licensing agreement with Novartis for a very large sum of money. So Novartis paid them $1 billion with options to go up to 1.9. So pharmaceutical companies generally don't shell out such a massive amount of money unless they're pretty confident in a drug. And so maybe they know more than me, maybe they know more than the general public about when PTC will seek regulatory approval, but it's certainly an exciting development. And I do think this summer is going to be very, very telling, both for PTC as well as uniQure. All right, continuing the good news train from the summer, we heard an update from Skyhawk Therapeutics in July, who are carrying out a phase 1 trial for their drug Sky 0515. This is another splice modulator, so it's very similar to Votoplam. It's that stop sign in the middle of the field. And so this is a phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trials are the first time that new drugs are ever given to humans. And so it's being tested in a very small number of people. The primary goal is safety. And the way that their study is designed, it has multiple parts. And so we heard news this summer from the first part of the study, which is where the drug is being given to people who do not have the gene for HD. And so far, Sky 0515 appears to be safe and well tolerated in that group of people without HD. And they show that they're able to engage the target. So they're able to lower Huntington, and the more they give, the more Huntington is lowered. So they know it's because of their drug. What was also encouraging from their update over the summer is that this drug appears to be very potent. So a little bit goes a long way, which is exactly what you want when you're a drug developer. And so with this good news, Skyhawk said they are now moving into the next part of their phase 1 trial, which will be testing Sky 0515 in people who do have HD. So the goal of this trial, it's still a phase 1. The goal will still be safety. And if they achieve that, then they'll move on to a larger phase 2 trial. And they said over the summer, potentially as early 2025, which is right now. So who knows? So I think individually, right, like there's certainly room for cautious optimism here. And I'm saying that not because of a specific clinical trial update, but rather when you look at all of these updates together, which is now 3 separate clinical trials that have data suggesting that Huntingtin lowering may improve clinical outcomes for Huntington's disease, what that data is starting to suggest is that Huntingtin lowering overall as an approach may be successful. I think we certainly need more, we need to test this more in larger groups of people, but for me, like this is what has been the most encouraging news of 2024. Not these many individual successes, which, oh my goodness, like are amazing on their own, but rather the totality of what all of this means. Because what this is really suggesting is that Huntingtin lowering as an approach may be able to get us to a disease-modifying drug for HD. And that is incredibly exciting. And when you think about it, this is just one area of potential disease-modifying drugs. This is just Huntingtin lowering. People are also exploring other ways to modify HD. And so there's lots of hard work that's being put in on various projects to build this pipeline that will generate the ideas and the data to go to future clinical trials that will help get these ideas from the lab to the clinic. Because the field will work like there is no treatment until we have one that is FDA approved. And after that, researchers will work to improve that treatment. Because our first treatment definitely won't be our last, unfortunately. So HD research is always going to be ongoing. There are always going to be scientists that are working behind the scenes, putting in this hard work that later translates to clinical trials and eventually headlines. To do that, basic research needs funding. And a primary way to make sure that basic research exists to feed this clinical trial pipeline is to support organizations like the HDF. Our sole mission is to find and fund promising research that will lead to treatments for HD. 88% of the money that we raised in 2023 went to supporting HD research. And in the past 8 years, we've given almost $17 million in research funding to over 100 recipients. And we do that through several key initiatives to help support HD researchers. The first, of course, is to fund research. We have annual awards that are $100,000 for grants over 1 year and postdoctoral fellowships over 2 years. With this one funding mechanism in the past 5 years, we've awarded about $7.5 million, and we are excited to announce our 2025 recipients soon. We also have our Transformative Research Awards, which are much bigger. These are $1 million awards given over 2 years, and their intent is to really drive HD research toward the clinic, to really move the needle toward a disease-modifying drug for HD. Our 2024 winners were a collaboration between Drs. Andrew Yu and Dr. Osama Al-Dulama. They will be giving a webinar this September about the work for which they won that award, so definitely make sure you register for that. And we're also excited to roll out an entirely new initiative this year that supports young HD researchers. So brand new in 2025, we are introducing the Huntington's Disease Career Advancement Grant, or HDCAG. And so this is an accelerator program for talented young investigators in the HD space. It provides them with the resources and the skills that are necessary for them to bridge the really difficult transition from being a postdoctoral fellow to being a tenure-track primary investigator. And our goal at the HDF is to ensure that we continue to have this abundant pipeline of talented researchers that are focused on Huntington's disease. I mean, essentially what we want to do is we want to make sure if an HD researcher retires, we are able to fill that seat with somebody else who's really passionate about HD research. So LOIs, letters of intent for this program opened pretty recently. So if you are a senior postdoc and you want to run your own lab, definitely head over to HDF's website and apply. And then we also have other initiatives that support not only the research community, but the HD community at large. So every other year, we host one of the world's most prestigious HD conferences in Boston, here along the Charles River. And in 2024, we were at maximum capacity with almost 300 researchers that were representing 16 different countries and 105 different institutions. A whole lot of science was being shared very collaboratively at this meeting. And we actually shared a webinar on this conference last year. So if you're interested in hearing more about the science that was shared at this meeting, you can head over to our YouTube channel to learn more. And then we also host workshops. So this is kind of an HDF staple. And these are small format meetings that are centered around a very specific topic in HD research. And we invite the world leaders on that topic together to get into the nitty-gritty of the science around that. How does this relate to Huntington's? What experiments do we need to do to drive this work forward? What collaborations can we form and with whom to really move the needle on this topic toward a treatment for HD? In 2024, we had 2 workshops, and we're excited to share that we're hoping to expand this initiative in 2025. And of course, we also host webinars about once a month. So if you're here, that means you found them. Gold star for you. Thanks for coming. We have a really great lineup for 2025. Registration is now open for the next several webinars. So definitely head over to our website and check out the lineup and register for those webinars. I'm very excited to see all of you there. And there's honestly, we have a lot more exciting things in store at HDF for 2025. And not only that, it's going to be a really big year for HD research. We have exciting new research directions that are being explored by various people across the globe. And we also have major clinical trial updates that are due this year that I think are going to be, they're going to be very interesting. So definitely stay tuned to HDF. We are excited to be your resource for research. I encourage all of you to connect with the HDF. You can go to our website and you can get on our mailing list and you can connect with us on the socials. Sign up for our webinar so that you can see my face again and just stay connected. All right, and so now I am happy to answer any questions that you may have. If you have been putting your questions in the Q&A box, please continue to do so. I will start going through those and we will just start at the top. Okay. So for people who are at risk, are there any supplements that they can take that may help? So I should probably start this off with a caveat that I am not a medical doctor. I am not qualified to give medical advice. I think the best place to start would be to talk to your neurologist or whomever you see, your general practitioner, whomever you see for people who are at risk. But what I would say is that there are no clinical trials on supplements that have shown that they will stop or slow progression of Huntington's. What we do know, what we do have a lot of evidence for, is that living a healthy lifestyle, eating a balanced diet, getting enough sleep. Sleep is really important for HD. And exercise. Those are all really important. Actually, there was a paper that just came out recently that showed that like cognitive stimulation, so learning a new language, reading books, like doing things that are actually very challenging for your brain, those are very good for HD. Are any of these treatments mentioned? Oh, wait. Are any of these treatments mentioned can only be considered after a patient shows signs of HD, or can they be done prior once they have a diagnosis? So currently, all of the treatments I mentioned, they're being tested in clinical trials. So to sign up for those, there are things called exclusion or inclusion criteria. And so there are certain metrics that they look for in people when they allow them to participate in a clinical trial. Currently, people do have to be symptomatic, but the reason it's really important to kind of understand why that is, right? Like, so if somebody has no symptoms and we start treating with this drug, how do we know if they're getting better? They don't have any symptoms, or like there's not a measurable change yet. And so if they're slightly symptomatic, we at least have something we can measure. Like, are their motor symptoms decreasing? Are they performing better on cognitive tests? And so we need to be able to measure things inside them that are changing because of HD so that we can measure if a drug is changing. And so while currently there are not clinical trials that are designed for pre-symptomatic people, I think we're headed there. There was a paper that just came out of like what will be a landmark paper from Dr. Sarah Tabrizi that showed that there's very subtle changes in the CEG repeat length in people's blood over time. And so there are measurable things that are very subtle, and so very, very sensitive tests are used to measure these things. And so I think we're headed toward pre-symptomatic trials, but we are not there quite yet. Okay. What is the difference between accelerated approval and full approval? I'm glad you asked this question because I did not have time to cover it. So accelerated approval means a regulatory agency will allow access to a drug while the company continues to test it. And so typically this is done for diseases with an undue burden and an unmet clinical need, which Huntington's clearly falls into that category. And so regulatory agencies are certainly looking at HD for that. What else did I want to say? Okay, so accelerated approval. A full approval means that the drug has been tested and it's on the market, and the company is no longer doing any testing. So it's safe on the market. Accelerated approval, they're still testing it. So if the company finds out later that actually the drug isn't doing what they thought, and actually it does have a lot of harm, that drug will be pulled from market. But they give the accelerated path for people to use it because there is an unmet need for that disease. Okay. Oh, what criteria need to be met for FDA accelerated approval? Also glad you asked this. So the FDA, when they sat down with uniQure, they agreed to, if the NFL level, so that biomarker that I talked about, which goes up because it's released from dead and dying brain cells, it goes up as HD progresses. So if NFL levels, they didn't say if it had to remain steady or go down, but they said they would use NFL levels as a biomarker for disease. And then also the CUHDRS, which, please don't ask me to say what all those letters mean, but essentially what it is a collection of tests that measure various components of HD. So it looks at motor score, it looks at cognitive ability, and overall is an assessment of how HD is progressing. And so this was actually the first time that the FDA agreed that they would use the UCHDRS for clinical outcome, for clinical determinant. And so I think this is a step in the right direction because it's the most comprehensive clinical battery that we have when we're assessing HD symptoms. And so those are the two things, the CHUDRS, I hope I'm getting these letters in the right name, and then the NFL. Okay. What particular trials are you most excited about? Okay, I like this question. So I am most excited about, I'm most excited about PTC. I didn't want to pick a clear winner. I think it's between uniQure and PTC, but the reason I'm most excited about PTC is because it's a pill. And I have reservations about how a brain surgery will be rolled out globally. I think there's limitations to healthcare access, and something like a small molecule that's a pill that can be taken once or twice a day. It has an easy washout. So if somebody is having bad reaction, they can stop taking it. Brain surgery is permanent. So that makes me a little nervous. but I think PTC, I like it. And I think 2025 is going to be a really telling year for both of those companies. Yeah, so both of those, and I really like PTC as well. Can you explain one and done? So good or bad results, that's it. Yeah, so that is it. So these brain surgeries, I mean, so they're introducing, it's basically a package, a little viral package that gets opened by your brain, and it contains contents that say lower Huntington, and you can't take that package back out. So the people that, started these trials are incredibly brave. They're just truly the astronauts of HD trials. Um, yeah, it's a one and done. So it means you would need one surgery and then done for the rest of your life. It's not spinal injections that might be every few months. It's not a pill that would have to be taken every day. Huntington will be lowered in these people's brains for the rest of their lives. So it's serious. And yeah, good or bad. And thankfully, right now, like Unicure did it in a very thoughtful way. They had a lot of animal models, they had a lot of indication to suggest preclinically, so in the lab, that this is a very viable approach. And they moved it to the clinic and they rolled it out very slowly. They did one person and then they waited like 6 months and they did another person, they waited. So they rolled it out very slowly and very conscientiously. And so far, it does seem like it's going well. I mean, it's safe and well tolerated, and these people may have slowed progression of Huntington's disease. That's very, very encouraging. Okay, what companies will be publishing updates in 2025? So certainly Unicure. I think that's going to come out. Usually they say quarter two, and when they say quarter two, they mean the very last moment of quarter two. So probably June is when we're going to hear from some of these companies. Certainly Unicure, certainly PTC. We might hear from Skyhawk. I'm not entirely sure. But definitely Unicure and PTC. And I think those are the two that are like hottest on people's radars as well. And then also Prolenia. Prolenia is seeking EMA approval for pridopidine. And we're due to hear in 2025 accelerated approval. So we're due to hear that in 2025. What kind of drug is Atalanta working on? So Atalanta is working on, it's an RNAi. And so what's unique about their approach is that they have some molecular wizardry, is how I'll describe it, that makes it disperse through the brain very, very well. So right now it would require brain surgery. They're in animal models, but they kind of have a leg up on other people because it goes through the brain really, really well. So they can inject it into one area and really it goes everywhere. But it's an RNA interference, so it works to lower Huntington. All right, I've kind of skipped around. Let me go back to the doctor. How are the patients ruled to get into these trials? What stage of HD is a good patient to get good results? So patients get in the trials based on an inclusion and exclusion criteria from the pharmaceutical side. Like from the patient side, it generally helps. Well, I know it helps. Like you have to have a relationship with your neurologist. You have to be seeing a neurologist who knows about these trials. Participating in Enroll HD, which is a global observational study. No drug is given. It's just designed to watch people as they live with Huntington's and without Huntington's. You can be gene negative and participate in that trial. Participating in Enroll is a really good way to get your foot in the door. And then what stage of HD is good to get results? It depends. So that will depend what the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trial are. There was the Huntington's Disease Integrated Staging System, the ISS, that came out a few years ago from the lab of Dr. Sarah Tabrizi. And it essentially stages Huntington's disease in a similar way that cancer patients are staged, like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And so Huntington's is stage 0, which is no signs, no symptoms, but you have the gene. And then stage 1 is when you're starting to show some symptoms. And so right now, what a lot of clinical trials are aiming at is late stage 1, early stage 2, kind of in that area, because that's a stage where there are measurable changes that are related to the disease that they will be able to know if their drug is changing that. Okay. Oh, do you have any information on the recent information about the use of beta blockers in treating HD? Okay. So the caveat here is that beta blockers were not used to treat HD. So that was something called a prospective study. It was not a clinical trial. And so essentially what that study did was it I forget what database it was from, but maybe it was enrolled. But anyway, so they looked at data from a lot of people that have Huntington's and don't have Huntington's, and they collect a bunch of information from them. One piece of that information being, do you take beta blockers? What beta blockers do you take? Do you have high blood pressure? All of this. And then they combed over that data to try and find associations. And what that paper found was that there is an association between people who took beta blockers and delayed onset of HD as well as decreased symptoms. So a caveat with that is that there was actually a paper published prior in 2023 that showed that there is not a correlation between some of these antihypertensive drugs, as they're called, and delayed and reduced progression of HD. And so I think there's a nuance, perhaps. Beta blockers are an interesting medication, right? Because they're prescribed for so many things. And the doses are wildly different. Like it might be a very low dose for anxiety, but a higher dose if it's for hypertension. And so a clinical trial would have to be run to know if beta blockers do actually influence the onset and progression of Huntington's. But there does seem to be something associated there, but there's not agreement in the field. So I think, again, I am not a medical professional. I'm not qualified to give medical advice. I would say reach out to your neurologist or your general practitioner, but there's not clear evidence. And it's certainly not people that take these beta blockers do have defined. It's just an association from one paper. Okay, somebody else asked about beta blockers, but hopefully that was also helpful for you. Oh, they're jumping around now. Okay. Okay. PTC is not exon 1. How can it be causing any benefit? Maybe it's working on somatic expansion. Okay, so there's a few things I want to dig into here. So for people who may not know, exon 1, it's referring to the very first little bit of the Huntington gene. So the genes are kind of like Legos. They're made up in different sections. And so researchers have found that the first Lego in Huntington that they call exon 1 is particularly toxic. And that's the part that contains the CG repeats. And so this person is saying that PTC, the Votoplam, the one that oral splice modulator is taking this pill, doesn't work on exon 1. How can it have any benefit? May it also be working on somatic expansion? The other piece about these oral splice modulators, I mentioned that they're not specific for Huntington, right? Like they're oral splice modulators. And so they are acting on other genes in someone's body. And serendipitously, perhaps, there was a paper that came out last year that showed that a different oral splice modulator, but very similar chemically, may also be targeting PMS1, which is a gene related to somatic expansion. So maybe totally serendipitously, how lucky would we be if we stumbled upon this class of drugs that not only lowers Huntington, but also modulates somatic expansion, to be determined. I think it's an interesting area. But to your point, right, like how can it be having any benefit? It could be having benefit because it is lowering Huntington. It might not be acting on exon 1, but it is lowering Huntington and may also be acting on somatic expansion. So I think the benefit that we're seeing perhaps from PTC or Votoplam is because of its Huntington lowering, and which may not necessarily need to act on exon 1. Are clinical trials, clinical studies done all over the world or mostly in the US? It depends. And actually, I think more and more studies are happening outside of the US. So Skyhawk is doing their study in Australia. And so the way that companies pick which countries that they want to do their trials in is they look at kind of like red tape, right? Like how expensive is healthcare? Healthcare in the US is very expensive, and it takes a long time to get things done. And so companies that may not have a ton of money, but they want to get a phase 1 trial done, they'll go to a company where it's cheaper, healthcare is cheaper, and they can get it done faster. And so certainly not done mostly in the US. They're really done kind of all over the world. But there are countries that have fewer clinical trials than others. I've heard from HD people in Ireland that there's never any trials in Ireland, and it's probably something to do with the bureaucracy and the cost of healthcare. But there are various factors that go into determining where a country does, or where a company does its clinical trials. What about somatic modulation? Do you think there's a possible clinical trial in the way? So I'm assuming you mean somatic expansion. Yes, I think clinical trials are well on their way for somatic expansion. There was a massive paper that came out from Dr. Steve McCarroll last week, showing that somatic expansion in brain cells within the striatum could be leading to their death. And so people are working on it. There's companies working on it. Locus 23 as well as Argenta are both working on somatic expansion, and they're headed toward the clinic. I think the caution there is that genes that control somatic expansion also control cancer. So I think we have to be careful. And I think people will be diligent, but it's just something to be aware of. But yes, yeah, we're definitely going to see clinical trials related to somatic expansion. Oh, is there a clinical trial in Spain testing 2B vitamin as a possible treatment for HD symptoms, biotin and thiamine? I think, yes, you are right, biotin and thiamine. Jose Lucas, he was doing that work. Yeah, I haven't heard anything about that trial in a while, but they are doing that. And that was because of a paper that came out that showed that those two vitamins had an effect on oligodendrocytes, I believe. It's been a while since I've read that paper. But yes, and that did move to clinical trials, but I've not heard anything about that in a bit. So I don't know the status of that. But if you email me or I can see your name, so I can reach out to you after and I'll look up what the status of that trial. Yeah, so this is an interesting one. Does drugs and alcohol use have a direct effect on the onset of symptoms of HD? Also, are there any studies that cover this? Yes, I can't cite the studies off the top of my head, but I can email you. I'll look them up. But yeah, we know that a healthy lifestyle is one of the best things that you can do to stave off signs and symptoms of Huntington's, even stress, right? Like people's HD symptoms get a lot worse under conditions of stress. And so not just like abstaining from alcohol and eating healthy, but just like, trying to reduce stress in your life, making sure you get enough sleep, exercising regularly, drinking enough water, like all of these things. Basically, the advice that you would give to anyone. That's good advice for everyone. And actually, we have a webinar coming up in March from Jill Livingston, who heads up the Lancet Commission on Dementia. And she's going to be talking about a recent paper that they published about 14 factors for a healthy brain. And so I think that will be really interesting. It's just general lifestyle things that people can do to keep a healthy brain that are also correlated with reducing associations of dementia. And so, yeah, living a healthy lifestyle, it can go a long way. Okay, there was a report released last week that said expansion of CEG's 150 trigger HD symptoms. Should people with HD get retested to see if their CEG repeats have grown? Okay, so to clarify, that paper did not show that CEGs of 150 or more trigger HD symptoms. That paper was a deep molecular analysis of somatic expansion within a specific cell type of the striatum. And it showed that repeats of 150 or more trigger molecular programs that could be leading to the death of that cell type, but not HD symptoms. They did not look at symptomatology at all. This was an entirely cell-based paper, like looking at the cells. Should people get retested? No. And so another thing about somatic expansion. So, okay, let me back up. So somatic expansion, the CEG repeat that causes HD tends to get bigger in some cells over time. So when your cell needs to make a protein, we talked about the central dogma of molecular biology. We have our genes, our message, our protein. When it goes to make a protein, our double-stranded DNA kind of gets unzipped and it makes the protein, and then the DNA comes back together. But sometimes it gets shifted and there'll be a little outpost here, and that can expand and get bigger and bigger. And so that tends to happen more frequently only in some cells. And what that paper that just came out last week from Steve McCarroll showed us is that medium spiny neurons of the striatum, this very specific type of neuron that we know to be particularly vulnerable in HD, they tend to have more of these expansions than other cells. And when it reaches that very critical length, 150 or more, they turn on all these programs, these molecular programs that could be leading to their death. That is that specific cell type. That does not happen in a grand majority of other cell types. In that paper, he also looked at other cell types within that same brain region, so things like glia, and they didn't have those really massive cell expansions. Another cell type where the CEG repeat is relatively stable is blood. And so if you get your CAG score when you're 18 and it's 41, when you're 60, it's very likely to be 41 because blood cells don't get these massive CEG repeat expansions. I do want to say something else because I did talk about Sarah Tabrizi's recent paper that showed CAG expansions in blood. I want to note that the tests that she was using were super duper sensitive. So she was seeing a difference, but she was using a really sensitive test where she was looking at like 0.1 to 0.2 CAG repeat expansions over half a decade. And so we don't see this perpetual speeding up of the expansions in blood. We don't see massive expansions in blood. If you got tested when you're 18, it's very likely the same when you're 60 or beyond. No need to get retested. Mhm. When you have this webinar in January of 2026, what would be your hope is a realistic big win that you'll be able to share? Okay, so this is a good question to go out on because we're getting low on time too. I'm going to be honest. I think 2025 is going to be like, we're going to have some decisions made this year. I don't think I've ever been so hopeful about a year. And I think by the time January 2026 rolls around, if not sooner, like there's going to be a bunch of fireworks going off and like all the party streamers that can go on behind people in their Zoom meetings, because I think 2025 is going to be a big year. I think we're going to hear from Unicure and PTC and perhaps a few other companies not far behind them. I don't know, this could be the year that we have a potential disease modifying drug on the market. So I think our January 2026 webinar could be some really, really good news. All right, so I think that's a pretty hopeful one to go out on. We're getting toward the end of our time here. So if you had a question that I didn't get to, which there were a lot that I did not get to, I will follow up with you. And if you didn't leave your email, if you didn't leave your name, and you want a question answered, please feel free to email me, Sarah Hernandez at hdfoundation.org. I'm very happy to help you sort through some of this stuff because it's a lot of research and I know it's really confusing. All right. So I'll end, and I want to thank everyone who donates to the HDF, who supports the research that we fund. And of course, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. Our next webinar is Tuesday, February 18th. We are going to be joined by Drs. Jongmin Lee and Dr. Chris Kay, and they're going to be telling us about their work on the CAG repeats that cause Huntington's and how we could target that for therapeutics. So registration for the next webinar is now open. So if you head over to the HDF website right now, you can get it on your calendar. So thank you all so much for joining, and I will see you next month.